And tonight's tale is by H.P. Lovecraft, entitled The Tree. On a verdant slope in Mount Malinus in Arcadia, there stands an olive grove about the ruins of a villa. Close by its tomb, once beautiful with the sublimest sculptures, but now fallen into as great a decay as the house. At one end of that tomb, its curious roots displacing the time-stained blocks of Pentelic marble, grows an unnaturally large olive tree of oddly repellent shape. So like to some grotesque man or death-distorted body of a man, that the country folk fear to pass it at night when the moon shines faintly through the crooked boughs. Mount Malinus is a chosen haunt of dreaded Pan, whose queer companions are many, and simple swines believe that the tree must have some hideous kinship to these weird Panessi. But an old beekeeper who lives in the neighbouring cottage told me a different story. Many years ago, when the hillside villa was new and resplendent, there dwelt within it the two sculptors, Carlos and Mercedes. From Lydia to Neapolis, the beauty of their work was praised, and none dared say that one excelled the other in skill. The Hermes of Carlos stood in a marble shrine at Corinth, and the palace of Mercedes surmounted a pillar in Athens, near the Pantheon. All men paid homage to Carlos and Mercedes, and marvelled that no shadow of artistic jealousy cooled the warmth of their brotherly friendship. But though Carlos and Mercedes dwelt in unbroken harmony, their natures were not alike. While Mercedes revelled by night amidst the urban gaieties of Tega, Carlos would remain at home, stealing away from the sight of his slaves into the cool recesses of the olive grove. There he would meditate upon the visions that filled his mind, and there devise the forms of beauty which later became immortal in breathing marble. Idle folk, indeed, said that Carlos conversed with the spirits of the grove, and that his statues were but images of fauns and dryads he met there, for he patterned his work after no living model. So famous were Carlos and Mercedes that none wondered when the tyrant of Syracuse sent their deputies to speak of a costly statue of Taishi, which he had planned for his city. Of great size and cunning workmanship must the statue be, for it was to form a wonder of nations and a goal of travellers. Exalted beyond thought would be he whose work should gain acceptance, and for this honour Carlos and Mercedes were invited to compete. Their brotherly love was well known, and the crafty tyrant surmised that each, instead of concealing his work from the other, would offer aid and advice. This clarity producing two images of unheard of beauty, the lovelier of which would eclipse even the dreams of the poets. With joy, the sculptors halted the tyrant's offer, and saw that, in the days that followed, it was heard the ceaseless blows of chisels. Not from each did Carlos and Mercedes conceal their work, but the sight was for them alone. Saving theirs, no eyes beheld the divine figures released by skilful blows through the rough blocks that had imprisoned them since the world began. At night, as of yore, Mercedes sought the banquet halls of Tega, while Carlos wandered in the olive grove. But as time passed, men observed a want of gaiety in the once sparkling Mercedes. It was strange, they said, amongst themselves, that depression should seize one, with so great a chance to win art's loftiest reward. Many months passed yet in the sour face of Mercedes, and came nothing of the sharp expectancy with which the situation should arise. Then, one day, Mythos spoke of the illness of Carlos, after which none marvelled again at his sadness, since the sculptor's attachment was known to be deep and sacred. Subsequently, many went to visit Carlos, and indeed noticed the pallor of his face. But there was about him a happy serenity, which made his glance more magical than the glance of Mythos, who was clearly distracted with anxiety, and who pushed aside all of his servants in his eagerness to feed and wait upon his friend with his own hands. Hidden behind heavy curtains stood the two unfinished figures of the Pixie, a little touched of late by the sick man and his faithful attendant. As Carlos grew inexplicably weaker and weaker, despite the ministrations of puzzled physicians and of his fastidious friend, he desired to be carried often to the grove which he so loved. There he would ask to be left alone, as if wishing to speak with unseen things. Mythos ever granted his request, though his eyes filled with visible tears at the thought that Carlos could care more for the fauns and dryads than for him. At last the end drew near, and Carlos discoursed of things beyond this life. Mythos, weeping, promised him a sculpture more lovely than the tomb of Melusis, but Carlos bade him speak no more of marble glories. Only one wish now haunted the mind of the dying man: that twigs from certain olive trees in the grove be buried by his resting place, close to his head. And one night, sitting alone in the darkness of the olive grove, Carlos died. Beautiful beyond words was the marble sculpture which stricken Mercedes carved his beloved friend. None but Carlos himself could have fashioned such bas-reliefs, wherein were displayed all the splendours of Elysium. Nor did Mercedes fail to bury close to Carlos's head the olive twigs from the grove. As the first violence of Mythos' grief gave place to resignation, he laboured with diligence upon his figure of Pixie. All honour was now his, since the tyrant of Syracuse would have the work of none save him or Carlos. His task proved a vent for his emotion, and he toiled more steadily each day, shunning the gaieties he had once relished. Meanwhile, his evenings were spent beside the tomb of his friend, where a young olive tree had sprung up near the sleeper's head. So swift was the growth of this tree, and so strange was its form, that all who beheld it exclaimed in surprise, and Mythos seemed at once fascinated and repelled. 3 years after the death of Carlos, Mythos dispatched a messenger to the tyrant, and it was whispered in the Agora that the mighty statue was finished. By this time, the tree by the tomb had attained amazing proportions, exceeding all other trees of its kind, and sending out a singularly heavy branch above the apartment in which Mythos laboured. As many visitors came to view the prodigious tree as to admire the art of the sculpture, so that Mythos was seldom alone. But he did not mind this multitude of guests. Indeed, he seemed to dread being alone now that his absorbing work was done. The bleak mountain wind, soughing through the olive grove and the tomb tree, had an uncanny way of forming vaguely articulate sounds. The sky was dark on the evening that the tyrant's emissaries came to Paegan. It was definitely known that they had come to bear away the great image of Pixie and bring eternal honour to Mythos. So their reception by the proxeni was of great warmth, As the night wore on, a violent storm of wind broke over the crest of Molinis, and the men from far Syracuse were glad that they rested snugly in the town. They talked of their illustrious tyrant, and of the splendour of his capital, and exulted in the glory of the statue which Mythos had wrought for them. And then the men of Paegan spoke of the goodness of Mythos, and of his heavy grief for his friend, and how not even the coming laurels of art could console him in the absence of Carlos. He might have horned those laurels instead. Of the tree which grew by the tomb, near the head of Carlos, they also spoke. The wind shrieked more horribly, and both the Syracusans and the Arcadians prayed to Helios. In the sunshine of the morning, the Pronoxy led the tyrant's messengers up the slope to the abode of the sculptor, but the night wind had done some strange things. Servants' cries ascended from a scene of desolation, and no more amidst the olive grove rose the gleaming colonnades of the vast hall wherein Mythos had dreamed and toiled. Lone and shaken mourned the humble courts and the lower halls, for upon the sumptuous greater peristyle had fallen squarely the heavy overhanging bough of the strange new tree, reducing the stately poem in marble with old completeness to a mound of unsightly ruins. Strangers and Paegans stood aghast, looking from the refuge to the great, sinister tree, whose aspect was so weirdly human, and whose roots reached so queerly into the sculpture of Carlos. And their fear and dismay increased when they searched the fallen apartment, for of the gentle Mythos, and of the marvellously fashioned image of Taishi, no trace could be discovered. Amidst such serendipitous ruin, kindly chaos dwelt, and the representatives of two cities left disappointed. Syracusans that they had no statue to bear home, Paegans that they had no artist to crown. However, the Syracusans obtained, after a while, a very splendid statue in Athens, and the Paegans consoled themselves by erecting in the Caria a marble temple commemorating the gifts, virtues, and brotherly piety of Mythos. But the olive grove still stands, as does the tree growing out of the tomb of Carlos, and the old beekeeper told me that sometimes the boughs whisper to one another in the night wind, saying over and over again, "Haida, Haida." I know. Lord, forgive me for what I'm about to do. By yours truly. I am not an evil man, prone to the infliction of suffering and horrors upon others, as did many of my status and position in my time, their horrors remembered throughout the ages, glorified in history books and media alike. I was, in fact, quite a philanthropist in my days, having donated lavishly to construct schools, libraries, hospitals for the destitute and infirm, many of which still bear my last name, though the ever-present ticking of time has seen new generations cease to revere those men of status and breeding of old, and name these structures anew to honour those of means in the present day. Certainly, the atrocities of man and my ancestors run through my veins, the shadows of bygone ages and pains inflicted, no more noticeable than blood itself, whilst kept in its proper place, yet just as close and inescapable. And yet we have railed against such things, with no desire to conquer my fellow man, nor to claim lands eternal. As a young boy of means and privilege, that many would have been envious of, I wished timely to learn. Being the second son, born into a wealthy merchant family that had long since acquired lordship, I did not stand to inherit the lands and holdings and business, and thus I was hardly groomed to do so. Instead, I was free to pursue what passions should take a young man, and for a timid child such as myself, that passion was in learning. From a young age I was determined to be a scholar, and my father, though he had little time for affections of his second son, was always more than accommodating and liberal with funds besides. Thus, we had a private library, the likes of which would stoke the green eyes of envy to life within any bibliophile. My tutors, only the very best of course, quickly became redundant to the many an afternoon and evening spent amongst the pages of my private collection. It was therefore decided, at the age of 12, that I should be sent to a boarding school across the sea, where I might be further educated by some of the greatest minds of the pre-industrial age. It was an emotional time for my dear mother, who had much preferred to keep me close to her bosom, but father was insistent, as was I. The eve before my departure, a going-away party was held, a lavish affair, as one might expect, attended by the families of high society, who brought lavish gifts and offered advice as well as congratulations to my parents and my attendance at one of the most premier boarding schools in the world. I was never interested in such gatherings, but to my delight, Uncle Tybalt attended. My favourite uncle. Tybalt was an explorer, and always happy to delight my soul with tales of his adventures of expedition for this institute or that, grand stories of ancient tombs and underground cities, of bizarre rituals in the Afric, or shadowy temples in the Far East. As was his typical habit, Uncle Tybalt brought me a gift, though this time not a fascinating ancient trinket smuggled from abroad, but rather a small collection of ancient times, their bindings old and tattered, the little bundle held together with a leather strap, delivered by his roughed hands, covered with the pockmarked scars he no doubt collected upon his adventures the world over. The collection had been wrapped in a velvet covering of deepest purple. I marvelled, delighted at the chance to uncover some ancient knowledge within them, though the script was in some ancient language and would need to be deciphered. The pictograms and drawings within were fascinating and awe-inspiring. Uncle Tybalt had thought of that too, however, and quickly presented me with a book of translations for the ancient scripts, though it only translated the ancient text into Hebrew, which I did not speak. If I wished to discover the secrets contained within, then my task was well in hand, and that task was one I was more than excited for. My time in boarding school taught me many things, from natural science to the latest teachings of psychology, geology, economics, languages. The vastness of human knowledge, even at such an early point in its history, was mine for the taking, and take it I did. I became something of a recluse in my years of study, where the other boys would be found in the courtyard between lessons, chasing a ball or else each other. I would be in one of the numerous libraries, mountains of books and parchment sprawled out on tables in front of me, illuminated by the naphtha lamps, well into the wee hours of the morning. As my classmates and I grew into early adulthood, it was common enough practice for the budding young men to travel into the nearby town and enjoy what fruits their parents' money could purchase for a pittance. Food and drink and the company of women, though I greatly preferred the company of the dusty times and the words of many a scholar that had come before me. Generations of learned men that had brought ink to paper, whose voices spoke to me in the quiet whispers of genius. I did not have time enough to waste on the folly of youth. If I were to embody all the knowledge and learnings of those great men that had come before me, not a moment of this lifetime could be wasted. I was granted but 6 short years at that revered academy to be educated, though I had devoured lessons quickly enough that in my 2nd year my aged professors had naught left to teach me. The remaining 4 years of time spent amongst the tomes and whispers of those that had come before, interrupted only by meals and the necessity of sleep, however, proved to be hardly enough time to work my way through the sheer bastion of knowledge contained within those hallowed walls. And so, we petitioned to remain at study, no longer of student age, but with more than enough funds at my disposal. My request was denied by the faculty who, no doubt, feared they would be overshadowed by myself, barely a man grown, and yet intellectual learnings dwarfed even the most learned scholar amongst them many a time over. Dejected, I returned home to the waiting arms of my mother, father, and brother, in what was meant to be a joyous reunion, but which I felt to be a prison sentence. For my thoughts were only of those whispers left behind, and what secrets of the universe and existence they might hold that I should never again lay eyes upon. My private collection of tomes and books, which in my youth had seemed so great a source of knowledge, now taunted me from their shelves, for I could recall at ease the entirety of their summation with barely a moment of effort. A man grown now, but still too young to be revered, I applied at several of the local universities for fellowship, and, failing that, for apprenticeship. And though my family name was prosperous and respected amongst the high society fools that once more surrounded me, I was rejected at every turn of academia. For I was too young, it was said, to turn away from the social life that awaited me in favour of the solitude that was perpetual learning. Too young, they had said. As if youth were not some fleeting excursion in this life, best consumed on that which held the utmost importance of this lifetime. Of the foolishness of their refusals, it stung me to my very core. This life itself was fleeting, comprised of precious few moments and hours. I lamented that I had but one lifetime to acquire knowledge, and here was so many of those precious hours being stolen from me by the incompetence of men who had wasted enough of their own time on the follies of youth. It was this fire and fury, the frustration of time squandered without choice, and a library of books already wrung of their mysteries, that I took again to the old bundle of books Uncle Tybalt had given me in my youth. Armed now with the knowledge of several languages and historical reference points, and an understanding of the natural sciences, I pored over the volumes with an all-consuming fervour. It took 3 months of hard study, translation and interpretation, holed up in that room that served as library, study and bedroom. I confess, I grew increasingly irritated with the interruptions that seemed endless. I had no desire for meals nor visitors, and more than once became unbecomingly short with poor Linda, a servant girl who had been in my father's employ for many a year. But oh, joy of joys, I heard once more the whispers of old knowledge, and ancient secrets in the words of scholars, such as myself, in times gone past, and understood the mysteries they told of in their dancing linguistics, the answer to the most ardent prayer of my soul. Thank you, Hiro, for that tea. Energised with the knowledge that what I sought could be discovered, I thus petitioned my aging father for the expense of expedition, though I told him not what I sought. The second son of a nobleman who stood to inherit little, I wished to seek out my fortune in forays into unknown lands, as Uncle Tybalt himself had done. Father was all too easily swayed by my plea, and with a sense of pride furnished me with all the funds I could need. Thus I began my life of exploration with the very finest of equipment, the lousiest of hired coaches and guides into unknown foreign lands, and a hired manservant named Hobbs, with whom we had become quite close over our years of adventure. And though the papers and journals of academia would tout my discovery of long-forgotten ancient cities in the Afric, and museums would proudly display artifacts from primitive cultures plundered from the humid lands betwixt the Bering Strait, I was stirred onward from one continent to the next, chasing a trail long since buried, but invisible to all, save myself. Inscriptions inlaid on ancient walls of stone, inscrutable to the eyes of others, but which spoke plain as day to me. Cave drawings in paint, worn to near invisibility by wind and exposure, that pointed from one civilization to the next, in an order seeming to Hobbes to be as random as the motion of clouds as they stirred across the sky. Ah, Hobbes, my only constant companion amidst an ever-changing crew of hired hands for these expeditions, he alone was privy to what I truly sought, and, once I explained the meanings of those subtle clues I would spy along the way, would spend many a late hour into the night, alone in our tent, bathed in the flickering lamplight, helping to puzzle out the direction of our next adventure. Many a time had I marvelled at his insights, and his uncanny ability to locate the entrance to a hidden passage, or to suspect an ancient booby trap laid for any such as ourselves that might venture into vaults and tombs, years after even the dead within had been turned to dust. And though my expeditions were no longer funded by the generosity of my father, who died when I was 25 and deep within the deserts of the land of Egypt, Bob stayed on, content enough to explore with me with only the funding provided by museums and universities for my discoveries, choosing a life of adventure and forgoing any tangible salary. My brother, of course, had taken over the family business and land holdings of our bloodline, though tensions between us had been strained since father's passing. Having missed the funeral proceedings and expedition, dearest Thomas mistakenly believed that I should, therefore, be exiled from the family, at which he now stood at the head. It mattered little enough to me, though word of disgrace reached my ears, half a world away, and the family name to which I felt no connection mattered no more to me than the siren call of the gallows upon which father had met his end. In my 28th year, word reached Hobbes and myself, by way of a seafaring merchant on the docks of what is now called Singapore, that Uncle Tybalt was not long for this world, and that I should return home to attend him. Though we made haste with all resource available to us, Hobbes and I arrived too late to see my beloved uncle off into the world which follows this. Bereaved as I was at his passing, I who had given my life its purpose, and ejected from the holdings of my ancestors, fortune yet smiled upon me. For Uncle Tybalt had amassed quite some small fortune of his own, and bequeathed its entirety to myself, from one second son to another. The holding, in a remote part of the country, where the grasses yet grew wild and danced in the winds upon the plains, did not compare in size nor grandiosity to that of old ancestry, but rather spoke of a different kind of splendour and opulence, cold and unyielding stone, forsaken in favour of gleaming wood and brick fireplaces fixed to nearly every room. The walls were adorned with tapestries from the world over, in many shades of colour than any man could hope to name, and beautiful oil paintings of fallen heroes whose glories sang from their thick frames, and whose rooms were filled, each, by artefacts and furnishings of 100 cultures and civilizations long forgotten, a bastion of preservation and silent reverie to history. It was here, in the splendid home of late Uncle Tybalt, that Hobbs and I, after many years of searching, made the discovery of a lifetime. Of several lifetimes, in fact. We had spent the better part of a fortnight combing through the labyrinthine rooms in an effort to catalogue the holdings, when Hobbs discovered, deep in the corner of the wine cellar, piled over with a collection of rags, a wooden box engraved with the most curious of markings. Curious to most, I have no doubt, but to me they were as familiar as the back of my hand. The symbols and star signs of hidden constellations and circulatory systems of beings not dreamed of by science or philosophy, as depicted in the little bundle of books Uncle Tybalt had bequeathed to me so long ago, the treasure map, as it were. And here now before me lay that treasure. I was certain of it. The gleaming wooden box was placed gingerly upon the large dining room table, the flickering glow of the chandelier illuminating every expertly carved scratch in its surface, until they seemed not carvings at all, but rather living pools of rivers and shadow somehow captured in the centuries-old petrified wood, before it was stained and polished and stained again until it gave off a reddish glow deeper than any mahogany. With a trembling hand, we reached to lift the lid from its resting place, the piercing blue eyes of Hobbs watching on with as much wild anticipation as I felt. There, inside the box, rested a little bundle in velvet of the deepest purple. It sat. I withdrew the little bundle, surprisingly heavy in my palm, and carefully unwrapped it from its opulent sheath with a breathless revelry, to reveal the object we had crossed the globe many a time over for, the key to the acquisition of all human knowledge that one mere lifetime could never grant. The means to defy the ravages of time and age and the frailty of man cast upon we unfortunate souls by the unyielding hand of a supposedly merciful deity. Not some golden fruit of a distant land, nor a well of putrid waters purported to reverse the effects of aging. Neither was it a gleaming golden chalice of the Lamb, nor a vial of unknown solution dreamt up by a foreign alchemist. No, my dearest Weary, the means to immortality take the form of an ancient brass pocket watch, its cogs and wheels as everlasting through the centuries as the centuries of his existence. Always just out of sight of those poor fools cursed with but one lifetime with which to chase its mysteries. Its ancient surface, like that of the box it contained, had been polished countless times by many hands in reverent acts of devotion, until it gleamed and sparkled and reflected the light as though shirking off the conventions of even that mortal construct. Someone, perhaps Uncle Tybalt himself, had attached a lavish chain of the finest gold to the body, but it might be kept close, whilst being practical as well. For at the end of the chain, where one might expect a gaudish gemstone or other such trinket of modern marvel, was attached, instead, a key to be used for winding. Its ears shaped as wings of some bygone flying beast, perhaps a dragon or some other ferocious creature, its end coming to a point as minute and sharp as the finest of sewing needles. How I longed to feel the whirling of the gears and cogs as they lay, perfectly still within my trembling hand, as though the heart of humanity itself seemed to beat its steady rhythm. And I knew at once what must be done. My fingers chased the length of the key. I grasped it firmly and plunged the pointed end into the centre of my right palm with a soft exhalation of breath that felt to be as a cry of reverent devotion before inserting the key into the smooth slot at the bottom of the watch face. The key turned easily, once, twice, 3 times, as the mechanisms inside tightened like an iron vice around my heart, clenching tighter and tighter until I feared it would surely burst. And on I turned the key, 4 times, 5 times, 6. My teeth clenched in pain as the air hissed over my strained vocal cords and whistled through my parted lips. 7 turns, followed by 8, and I collapsed heavily to my knees, unable to remain on my weakened legs, still clutching the watch and key in my hands. 9 turns, 10, and I laid back against the hard floor, unable to hold my head up as light burst beneath my eyelids. The formation of galaxies and planets, the universe itself, expanding rapidly in reds and purples and whites, and other hues, the likes of which my mind could not even fathom, burst forth. Hobbs, please! I managed to rasp in desperation, my hands curled and clutching at the watch and key. In the vice grip of death, unable to turn further for the weakness of my limbs and the strangle of my most sacred organ, the constricting hand of time in its threat to crush my beating heart where it stood, frantically beating in my chest, robbing me of sense and reason and any dexterity of motion. Dutiful Hobbs, his eyes piercing as the fresh fallen snow and their intensity at once dropped to my side, and, merciful in his dedication, placed his hands over my own, the sensation of his flesh burning me into cinders as he forced the final 2 turns, snapping the bones and ligaments of my hands with his roughness. My last thought before my heart stilled and I was lost from consciousness was of his face, contorted with grief and intensity, before I slipped into oblivion. I awoke several hours later, my eyes widened in some fashion I can never seek to explain, as if every nuance of colour provided by existence, which hides in unseen shadows, were open to me now, and as plain as the day is long. And all the while, as I surveyed the new world around me, a soft, gentle ticking filled some small space in the back of my consciousness. The beating of my heart synced irrevocably with the subtle ticking in my head on the face of the pocket watch. Hobbs, ever dutiful, had moved me to my bed and stripped me of my day clothes, no doubt having been covered in sweat and pile and who knows what else from the episode, but had known better, bless him, than to part me with the machinery that would become my most beloved obsession. I called for him, and he helped me to dress, a task nearly impossible with my gnarled hands and broken fingers, and the watch was placed in my coat pocket, always within reach. He spoke not of what had transpired, neither did I, but his eyes showed a glimmer of knowing and understanding that was unmistakable. And now my own countenance was rife with pride and satisfaction. Time, it seemed, was now quite literally in my pocket, and mine to command. It was not without its drawbacks, of course. For every 3 days, the watch would need another minute offering of blood and winding, lest it stop along with my heart. But that time was preceded by a loudening of the ticking in my mind that normally marked the moments of eternity, usually regulated to a quiet, almost unnotable space in the back of my mind, coupled with a sluggishness of my limbs, which were unmissable signs. I, therefore, did not have to fear that I should become absent-minded, nor forget the necessity, and thus sacrifice, my immortality. The winding did not take on the same panicked and painful affliction of the first either, a blessed painess, but rather a silent moment of breathlessness, where my heart ceased to beat in time with the clockwork, and of course I relied upon Hobbs for its completion until such time as my hands were healed. I would give him a certain look and a deep nod, and without a word from either of us, the task would be completed in silence, and then at once forgotten. We lived then for a number of years in unparalleled joy. I in ponderance and scholarship over the wealth and knowledge that Uncle Tybalt had left, and then in academic discourse through post, with a plethora of universities which provided more than enough means to maintain a lifestyle long since forgotten. With the downfall of my family name and holdings, the ever dutiful Hobbs at my side, to tend to the needs and fancies of the household, in ever constant companionship. Soon enough, though, the years of petition and learning, I no longer had need to send for books and scrolls and curiosities, but rather I was sought out by explorers. And adventurers, for their counsel and sage-like wisdom. Even the royals paid homage with restoration of my family's status and holdings as I became the so-called created baron. I took a wife of means and good breeding, and on occasion, though I was loath to do so, performed my husbandly duties by her when occasion demanded. Though she were lovely enough and of good bloodline besides, I far preferred the hours of contemplation surrounded by the voices of scholars. No longer whispers to my ears, but hearty conversation in the company of my dear, devoted Hobbs, to the society of my lady wife. Fortunately, she was content enough to her own dealings and friends besides, enough to allow me my days and nights in the study that had become as the beating heart of the manor, illuminated as much by the naphtha of the shining devotion of my one true companion. She, of course, knew nothing of the pocket watch, nor would she ever. As in my youth, Hobbs was the only other living soul that shared this, and many other an intimate secret. As the years passed with their gentle, rhythmic ticking, it became of a ponderance that my visage remained untouched by the ravages of gravity, and soon it became necessary to conduct, through some small exertion of applied application, some small scandal which would remove myself from public eye. With the help of Hobbs, I seemed also immune to the passage of time, perhaps owing to his aid in winding the watch for the first time all those years ago. I was convicted on charges of negligible bribery and bidden to retire with my lady wife away from public eyes. This was, of course, a matter of deepest shame for poor Blanche, and divorce soon followed, leaving me alone at last, with nothing but my beloved instruments of learning, and my devoted Hobbs, as I had always wished. Time progressed onwards, never ceasing, as the world began to change around us, unseen from within the walls of our lavish vestibule of art and academic reverie. And all too soon it became necessary that Hobbs and I, many decades past our natural exploration, and yet appearing still to be but a few years out of proper schooling, to relocate to the bustling metropolis that had become the new world across the sea. An industrial powerhouse in its own right, despite the atrocities committed both by and against the settlers. We relocated to a remote estate, not far from the shining white city of Chicago. Here now, humanity had made such advances in science and technology, and new instruments of inflicting the most unspeakable horrors. Hobbs and I watched it all, sheltered in the learnings of many an age that the poor souls of the believers could not possibly comprehend. As the vastness of the cosmos coalesced above, unseen and unnoticed by their new instruments of science, but which the voices of the ages spoke of in whispers, barely intelligible to even my own learned mind. It was at the end of the Second Great War, my hands already scarred over with a glistening sheet from the endless pricking required by the sacred watch, that humanity set a course none could possibly have understood. Thousands of lives, vaporized in an instant, sacrificed across time and space to the great beyond in a monument to the hubris of scientific advancement. There had been atrocities of untold volumes the countless ages that had passed before my eyes, documented and scoured over and wrung of learning for generations, but all paled in comparison to the way countless souls ripped across the cosmos, shuddering even the unshakable clockwork of the pocket watch. At 8:15 a.m, its cogs and wheels shuddered and stood still, along with my heart. From that moment, the endless ticking in my pocket was no longer mine to control. The steady, ever-present ticking in the back of my mind, at times gone completely, and others so loud that it drowned out even rational thought. The predictable nature of infinity was now irrational and fragmented. I languished in anguish, as even my dear beloved Hobbs was lost to me, blinked out of his eternal extended existence by the momentary stoppage of the clockwork. Grief as immeasurable as the damage to the cosmos consumed me, and for years I did little but wander the halls and rooms of this modern home, the oil-painted figures of history my only companions. Study of the latest scientific advances held no fascination for me, nor the breakthroughs in technology or psychology, nor the mutterings of the so-called archaeologists that got history so abysmally wrong. For I was now consumed, mind and soul, by the incessant ticking that was always there in the rooms across the empty prison. Without the serenity of eternal knowledge, the quiet ponderings of hubs to distract me, eternal life seemed unbearable. And so too did it in fact become unbearable in its unpredictability, for the ever-present ticking would swell in volume, no longer came as expected. Gone was the familiar pattern of 3 days' time, as if my heart could no longer hold time as expected. Losing time, it seemed, as if the clocks and gears of the carefully crafted clockwork of the cosmos were at last winding down for good, or else slipped from their steady course by some interdimensional rift. It might be a week before I had need of the jab of the needle key into my tarnished flesh, or it might be merely an hour before I could feel my heart struggling in my chest. The frantic rhythm intersected with times I still wondered that it had ceased to beat at all. And all the while, the incessant ticking from within my skull that rattled my teeth and resounded off the walls with the beating of my heart as a drum through the sands of eternity, shattering thought and logic and reason. Sleep would not come, but for the aid of copious amounts of whisky, which caused the lamentations for my departed hubs, my only confidant in this eternal life, snatched so cruelly and irrevocably from existence itself by the hubris of man. I awake, time after time in panic, desperately clutching for the key to wind, never knowing how much longer I might continue, or when at last I too might slip from this existence. Pacing my halls, up and down, my footsteps in time, with the never-consistent ticking madness of an unstable eternity alone. How I hate these paintings that adorn the walls with their mocking smiles, as if they alone understand the misery wrought upon me by the tinkerings of man, even with a twisted, frozen smile ripped from the waters of the river Nix to taunt me with their piercingly bright eyes, blue as the ice at the deepest darkness of the Arctic, and as distant as the furthest eclipse, paling in comparison to the whispers of the old masters that once gave me purpose and solace, never to be heard again but for the dredging and uneven metering of time. Heartbeats of wild conflagration, of no more musical styling than the ambitions of the modern streetcars that roll past all hours of the day and night. I have shuttered my windows against the piercing sounds of the ever-changing city outside my walls, unable to break through the deafening curs of the ticking inside my skull and chest, and the key to this infernal watch of the damned never far from my palm, ready to pierce into the last vestiges of bygone humanity in vain effort to preserve this life despite the torment. Oh, Hobbs, if only we had known, all those nights ago, bathed in the sultry light of naphtha lamps of the tent we shared in the Afric, where this pursuit would lead, or that I should suffer eternity without you. It was your nights that led us down this path, the vision of those ice-cold blue eyes of yours that allowed us to pierce the veil of time and pursue the forgotten lands in search of this, the most sought-after of prizes. Your endless devotion that pressed me onward through the jungles and foreign lands and haunted paths of this earth, to tread where men ought never step foot. Your burning hands overpowering my own weakness to seal this fate. Your contributions tick off with each drumming, thunderous measure of time. How many years has it been since I heard your sweet voice, or even my own footsteps upon the floors, as I pace endlessly back and forth? How many more laps might I take through the endless house to view the paintings, with their smirking and twinkling eyes that sparkle in the dwindling light, on legs unsteady with the rhythm of the tick, tick, ticking, and the pockmarks of the dreaded needle? I can't stand it any more, Hobbs. There must be a way to end this suffering. The return to the blessed silence of quiet contemplation, to the whispers of the old scholars bequeathed to my young mind by late Uncle Tybalt all those centuries ago. Yes, perhaps in the turnest and aged pages of the ancient tomes, tucked away from the light, I might find sense to reason of this affliction, of the rift across space and time. Perchance I might even again hear your voice, Hobbs, rather than the dreaded and inscrutable drumming of my clockwork heart reverberating off the walls amongst the scrawled images and faded text, rather to be subjected to the poor facility of your eyes of these cursed paintings that stare out of their frames, each pass becoming more and more antagonistic, until it would seem to me that they should leap from their canvas tomes, their hands curled in the grip of death into pockets or saddlebags, and there, a glint of golden chain to reveal their secrets, that they too once knew the scope of eternity provided by this construct of the cosmos. The clockwork manufactured by no human hands, though whole of these centuries, but rather by some conflagration of existence as vast and unknowable as eternity itself. The cleansing torch of fire, pure fire, shall rid me of their sins. They who sought knowledge without understanding, and immortality without consideration of its weight, I shall rip them down from their perches atop these ivory walls, this house of lies, and watch as they splinter into ashes to choke my throat and blacken my lungs until there is nothing left of them but a memory trying out by the uneven gait and thunderous applause of the clock of the damned, burning any recollection of the wickedness of knowledge alone with them. And so they burned in a massive fire right there in the middle of the living room floor, that had long since ceased to see anything truly living. And as the sweltering heat and choking acrid black smoke filled my lungs, the voice of my beloved Hobbs, with all the clarities of the bell of Notre Dame, on a crisp autumn morning, delivering such insight as he had in those days of old, when time was short, that I had grown too mad, too weak, to do what must be done, to erase all traces the world over of this enchanting and tantalising echo of eternity. I am not an evil man, driven to seek the fortunes across all of space and time, but rather more than a pawn in this cosmic game of tragedy, wrecked by the madness of wisdom. I have presented, by way of an anonymous donation to a local orphanage, a small bundle of 3 ancient tomes, wrapped in velvet of the deepest purple, and secured with a leather strap, which was received by the toothy smiler and shining ice blue eyes of the Turman, his hands so hot as to scald my own scarred and pock-marked flesh as he accepted them and assured me that they would find a good home. As I sit here now, surrounded by the endless tick, tick, ticking like the thunder of countless storms throughout the ages, I can feel that telltale sluggishness in my limbs that demands, with no uncertainty, the winding of this infernal instrument of my own demise. Lord, Forgive me for what I'm about to do, and grant me the strength enough of my limbs to wield the cleaver that glints in the candlelight to its intended purpose, that these words might be the last creation my damnable hands might ever bring upon this earth, and the serenity of the blessed silence I so took for granted in my youth.